The girl could no longer walk, so she crawled to the latrine on her elbows, ribs like sticks under paper skin, after serving 5 or 6 soldiers a day in a cave outside Nanjing. An American priest, Reverend John McGee, listened to her story in February 1938 and visited her again and again, writing down what she said, how she was taken, how her family was bayoneted, how she was raped day after day and dropped when disease took hold. He carried a camera and a notebook, and later his testimony travelled to a courtroom where the world faced what had been hidden. That's our starting point. America didn't just fight. America recorded, preserved, and prosecuted. In a war of metal and fire, the first act of American power was moral clarity and proof on paper. The system McGee exposed was not random. It was planned, supplied, and guarded by the Imperial Army. Scholars compiled the math from army planning ratios: 29 soldiers per captive woman, a replacement rate as high as 3.5 to 4 because women were destroyed by disease, injury, and murder. Crunch that against 3 million troops, and you get a spread between roughly 362,000 and 414,000, enslaved across the Asia-Pacific, with about 200,000 of them Chinese, not the handful claimed by deniers. Those aren't estimates thrown from thin air. They come from records, testimony, and field research that survived the burn pits. Numbers aren't the point, but they do tell a truth. The scale was industrial. 12 survivors in one careful study describe abduction, transport, and captivity from Shanxi to Hainan, Shanghai to mountain villages in Yunnan. Their stories match local witnesses and regional records like gears meshing. The euphemism was comfort, but the reality was a war machine that institutionalized mass rape, a command and supply system that treated women as consumables. The line between licensed facility and field atrocity was a blur because they fed each other. The station didn't stop random assaults, it encouraged them. This is why proof matters. A camera, a priest, a hospital chart, a place name on a map, and a date on a line of orders. Here's the hook that flips the script. When American troops landed in Japan after victory, some Japanese officials tried to restart the same state-brokered vice under a new label, the Recreation and Amusement Association, to channel GIs into controlled brothels. The plan lasted months, not years. On the 21st of January 1946, a short American order cut the wire. The maintenance of licensed prostitution in Japan is in contravention of the ideals of democracy and inconsistent with the development of individual freedom. In plain English, shut it down. Brothels were placed off limits and closed. The system tried to bend. The order made it break. It wasn't perfect, and black markets popped up, but the state-run framework collapsed under policy from the top. That's what American power looks like when it binds itself to principle. A Japanese woman who had been recruited into the RAA stared at an off-limits sign and asked, "They closed it?" The shock was real. Soldiers from other empires had taken what they wished for centuries. This army arrived with rules and wrote them down. The difference isn't just in uniforms or flags. It's the idea that victory means the strong limit themselves for the future they want to build in the enemy's capital. That idea travels farther than any tank. It shaped patrol routes, courtrooms, and the way MPs spoke to civilians at midnight. It said the law follows the flag. So the chapter's impossible question becomes simple. Did American restraint make America weaker? The answer is a hard no, and the proof is coming in steel and numbers you can't forget. But first, remember the girl in the cave, the priest with the camera, the affidavit on the judge's bench. America's victory is not just that the guns fell silent. America's victory is that the truth outlived the gunshots. The world would know exactly what ended and why it should never return. The uniform would stand for food handed to a clinic and for rules posted on a door, even when no one was watching. A military policeman grabbed the sign with both hands and tore, wood fibers snapping like bones, letters that read "licensed" splitting in two, as the crowd watched. It happened on a Tokyo street not long after the order landed from General Headquarters. The memo was short and cold. Licensed prostitution violated democracy and freedom. American chaplains had warned that any tolerance for state brothels would rot the soul of the occupation. The commanders listened. The paper became policy, and policy became action on the sidewalk. Japanese officials had cobbled the RAA together in August 1945, thinking they could contain the conqueror's appetite and protect respectable families. Recruiters pulled in waitresses and war widows. Managers promised food tickets in a starving city. The logic was brutal. Give the GIs a pressure valve. But American officers read their own War Department rules and saw the trap. Keep the machine going and you normalize the system the war had just exposed in China and Korea. Shut it, and you risk disorder. They shut it anyway. Facilities were placed off limits and closed in early 1946. The state could no longer broker flesh in the name of peace. A composite GI, call him Staff Sergeant Turner of the 8th Army, wrote home, "We wear our flag on the sleeve but carry something heavier on our backs and what folks think it stands for." He had seen the notices and the MPs at the doors. He had also seen the medics handing out sulfur powder, the public health units tracking venereal disease by the book, not by rumour. He'd watched a Japanese nurse laugh when a supply clerk shared a tin of powdered milk for a clinic baby. Those small things mattered. They built a different kind of fear and a different kind of respect. The uniform was not a license. It was a promise. The revelation that ties this to American superiority is simple and startling. America didn't just win because it had more men and more guns. It won because it had more control over its own power. The same culture that built a B-24 every 63 minutes at Willow Run could shut a vice network by memo in Tokyo. The same country that could launch a Liberty ship in 4 days could also decide at speed that law would rule even in victory. Scale and self-restraint lived in the same house, and that house was called the United States. The enemy's shock shows up in small faces. A former RAA recruit sees an off-limits placard and whispers, "They closed it?" A city official grinds his teeth because the foreigners he expects to be predators arrive, quoting ideals. The bureaucrats misread the conqueror. They expected hunger, not honesty. They expected convenience, not conscience. Instead, they faced an organization that punished its own to protect the very people it had defeated. That breaks old patterns. That makes new futures possible. Here's your holy shit fact to bridge what comes next. While the street outside changed, the shop floors back home had already changed the war. A bomber rolling out every hour, cargo ships sliding from dry docks in numbers that made U-boat captains do the math and lose sleep. If you want to know why America could afford to be decent, it's because America could afford to be decisive. The arsenal and the ethic moved as one. And now we turn to the avalanche that buried tyrants in steel they could not replace. The question hits like a jab. Didn't abolishing state brothels risk chaos among thousands of young men far from home? The answer sits in an order dated the 21st of January 1946, and in what happened after it. The occupation did not collapse. The soldiers did not lose discipline. The mission did not drift. That memo Scapin 642 wasn't a sermon. It was a steering wheel, and Americans kept their hands on it. The conqueror limited himself, and the troops enforced it at the door, at the bar, in the alleys. That's a different kind of power. Compare that to what had been normal under the regime America defeated. Testimonies, cross-checked with witnesses and matched to specific towns from Shanxi to Hainan, describe soldiers dragging daughters from homes, marching them to stations, and cycling them through rooms until they broke. The system did not reduce random assaults. It fostered them. The words are plain. Institutionalized mass rape. A military logistics network for crimes. That's what the order in Tokyo drove a stake through. Ending the licensed framework mattered because it said, out loud and in writing, that a modern army answers to values, not appetite. Now bring on the American mic drop. In 1939, the US military bought fewer than 3,000 aircraft. By the end of the war, America had produced roughly 300,000 planes. That isn't a curve. That's a wall of aluminum, plywood, rivets, and courage that rose in 4 years. At Willow Run, Henry Ford's people timed the line, one B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes by 1944. Imagine the noise, the smell of cutting oil, the jig fixtures locking like jaws, the Pratt & Whitney engines hauled on dollies, and a bomber easing out the door as a siren whooped at the hour mark. The enemy could shoot down planes. He could not shoot down time. Ships told the same story. The Liberty ship SS Robert E. Peary went from keel to launch in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes at Richmond Yard No. 2. 250,000 parts, 14 million pounds of steel and fittings, welded and aligned, launched on the 12th of November 1942, 7 days after the keel was laid. At production peak, average Liberty builds ran around 6 weeks, but records like the Peary proved the system's sprint capacity. Submariners did their math on tonnage sunk versus tonnage launched, watched the curve flip, and felt the cold sink in. Numbers can break morale. America used numbers like artillery. A human moment seals it. A Korean POW rescued from a transport pen in China remembers an American medic cleaning a bayonet wound, then an officer asking his name slowly to write it correctly, letter by letter. The POW later says, "They did not own me, and they acted like they knew it." That line is everything. Ownership versus stewardship, predation versus policy. The same people who could field M1 Garands by the million and P-51D Mustangs to escort bombers all the way to the target could also look a stranger in the eye and see a future citizen, not a tool. That's the American edge. And the enemy's shock? It isn't always a scream. Sometimes it's a silence on a dock, when a Liberty ship slides by in fresh grey paint. Sometimes it's a bureaucrat staring at a closure notice for a vice district. Sometimes it's a captain reading a memo that tells him the law applies to him the same way it applies to the defeated. That is when resistance starts to feel pointless. That is when a war ends not only on paper, but in the habits of a society. We're not even to the peak yet. Next, we stack these chapters of restraint on top of a production miracle so large it is almost hard to see. Then we show how a nation that could outbuild the world also taught the law to walk in a conquered capital. A foreman at Willow Run slammed his palm on the line clock, and a B-24 Liberator rolled toward daylight as if a factory had learned to breathe metal. The smell was cutting oil and hot rivets, the sound a storm of air wrenches rat-a-tatting like distant gunfire, the sight a bare aluminum whale growing skins and ribs in minutes. One bomber every 63 minutes at peak, an hour hand that erased doubt as cleanly as a chalkboard wipe. Workers in denim and headscarves watched Pratt & Whitney engines drift on dollies, watched oxygen bottles slide into racks, watched the Norden site disappear behind plexiglass, and knew the equation had tilted. The enemy could fight brave, he could not fight time. They called the Liberator a long-legged brute. 4 engines, 10, 50 cals, a 110-foot wingspan that filled a hangar door. Ford turned farm boys into fixture wizards, taught them to read micrometers, then paired them with engineers who broke each airframe into bite-sized stations. That's the American trick. Complicate nothing that must be simple. Simplify nothing that must be exact. Subassemblies came in by rail from Buffalo, Tulsa, and Inglewood. A tail from here, a wing from there, a cockpit from a shop that used to stamp car hoods. The line married strangers with tolerances tight enough that parts made in Michigan locked to a spar drilled in California. Only a free economy could swap that many partners and keep the dance in time. A staff sergeant from the 8th Air Force toured the plant on leave and wrote only one line home: "They are building my life expectancy, an hour at a time." He had flown in a Liberator with a patched belly and a crew that slept sitting up on flak vests. He walked under the new ships and touched a rib as if it were a living thing. "I trust this one," he said to no one. He understood the math. More planes meant more coverage. More coverage meant more bombers home. More bombers home meant the enemy's factories. Marshalling yards and airfields would vanish under a blanket that refreshed itself faster than flak could tear it. The revelation behind the roar is character wearing coveralls. America did not merely build. America learned at speed. Jig errors on Monday became revised blueprints by Thursday. A bottleneck at Station 47 turned into a rolling stockroom that arrived pre-sorted by weight and reach. Women who had never touched an air tool learned to hold tolerances that would shame a watchmaker. A shift boss taped a sign above the wing route, "Every rivet counts someone's son." That's not a slogan. That's national purpose distilled. We talk about planes, but the payload was confidence. We won because we smothered the enemy in an avalanche of production, William S. Knudsen said. And you can hear it in the line whistle. The enemy's shock began as a whisper in a briefing room. Intelligence officers pinned photos on corkboards on Monday, a rail bridge in perfect health. On Wednesday, a hole where steel had been. On Friday, another wave inbound with fighter escort. Intercept spoke of pilots who could not find clear skies, because American formations arrived like weather. Radar plots looked like summer thunderheads. Planners who once believed attrition would balance the fight stared at curves that refused to bend. When the machines arrive on a schedule, courage alone is not strategy. Courage becomes a tax that accrues interest you cannot afford. A mechanic named Lizzie wiped her hands and grinned at a tail gunner who toured the station. "We built that turret like a church bell," she said, knuckles rapping the metal. He answered, "Then ring it. This is what a republic sounds like when it goes to work. No one is a cog. Everyone is a craftsman. The B, 24D, the J, the M letters and blocks that mark out a river you can cross with your eyes closed because the far bank keeps moving closer. America taught mass to act like a mind. Bridge to what comes next is easy. Ships. You can throw planes at an ocean, but you win oceans with hulls. The men stalking the sea in steel shadows believed they could starve democracies to death. They had not met Kaiser's yards at full stride. They had not met welders who treated calendars like enemies. They had not met a country that could turn blueprints into a tide. The clock that built bombers was about to float cargo, and cargo was going to feed armies, allies, and, yes, even the enemy we had defeated, because Americans believed the end of war should look like a beginning. A welder in Richmond blinked at the chalkboard and laughed out loud. "Launch on the 12th? We just laid the keel." Someone slapped a stopwatch. Someone else rolled out more rod. The SS Robert E. Peary rose in a hiss of sparks and a rain of slag, plates kissing frames, frames kissing keel, a skeleton that put on muscle in hours. 4 days, 15 hours, 29 minutes from keel to launch. The bottle cracked against her bow, and the yard went quiet for a half-breath, as if everyone realized they had just punched a hole in the dictionary definition of impossible. Liberty ships were ugly on purpose, the kind of ugly that wins wars. 441 feet of straight-lined stubbornness, a triple expansion engine that would not quit even if it coughed. Welds instead of rivets, because welds were faster, fewer men, fewer leaks, fewer delays. Henry J. Kaiser taught the yards to think like a clinic, triage the bottlenecks, batch the tasks, move the patient from table to table while specialists swarm. Pre-outfitted sections slid on greased ways. Bulkheads arrived with ducting and wiring already in their bellies. A crane driver named Red swore he could smell deadlines. "Smells like hot rain," he said, wiping grit from his teeth. The revelation here is arithmetic with a soul. Submarines were predators, but predators hunt a herd. America built the herd. By mid-war, the average build time settled around 6 weeks, while dozens of ships slid down ways each month from Richmond, Portland, and Bethlehem Fairfield. Convoy math flipped. U-boat skippers watched tonnage curves and forgot how to smile. A captain who once bragged he could reap the Atlantic like wheat stared at a plot where sinkings could not touch launchings. Liberty hulls carried wheat, trucks, boots, bombs, penicillin, and the thing dictators fear most: choice. When a democracy chooses to outbuild you, your courage has a short half-life. A shipfitter named Maria kept a notebook of numbers and names. Hold 3 Amos in pipes, Ida in vents, Chen in electrics, she wrote, like a prayer. She had a brother with the 1st Cavalry Division and a husband in the Merchant Marine. She traced their routes on a kitchen map with black string. Every time a Liberty sailed, she added a pin. She made stew on payday and fed 3 girls from the dorm next door who were saving for a war bond. I can't fly a P-51D, she said, but I can float its fuel. The furnace in her words warmed more than iron. The enemy's shock came with the convoys. Grey wolves needed space, uncrowded sea. Long gaps. Slow prey. The sea got busy. Escorts grew fangs. Hedgehogs and depth charges. Radar that saw through fog. HF divided by DF that caught whispers on the air. But the deepest wound was morale. You cannot terrify a conveyor belt. You cannot bluff a calendar. When a shipyard can lay down a vessel faster than your torpedoes can be made, your tactics are history, and history is not on your side. Bridge to the next revelation runs through a warehouse door. Crates marked for Yokohama shared a space with crates marked for Bremen. The United States did something odd and huge. It fed the people it had beaten. Flour, condensed milk, sulfur drugs, seeds, machine tools, textbooks, mimeograph machines for new town halls. Liberty ships brought relief alongside reconstruction. A longshoreman joked that the cargo smelled like a pantry for a continent. That pantry did more than fill bellies. It built a political future. While other empires starved their enemies into obedience, Americans shipped calories and paper and told a conquered capital, "We mean to build a peace you can vote for." A quartermaster in Yokohama stared at a requisition list and grinned at the strangest line item he had seen in the war. Infant formula for an enemy city. The docks clanged and clattered, cranes swinging pallets ashore while a cold wind blew up the bay. On a pier that once shipped soldiers to conquest, boxes of sulfur and penicillin stacked like bricks for a hospital, sacks of flour rose like pale hills, and tins of milk rattled in their cases. Military police stood easy but alert, checking passes, watching the flow, making sure the law walked the same path as the cargo. The order had gone out months earlier. Licensed brothels were off limits, state exploitation shut, and the uniform would mean restraint. Inside a clinic near Shimbashi, a Japanese nurse shaved a wounded forearm and swabbed it with iodine while a U.S. medic set out gauze and a vial. He spoke slowly, careful with words. She answered with a laugh when he mispronounced a phrase, and then, without ceremony, handed him the baby scale. A lieutenant from Civil Affairs briefed the staff on public health surveys. Venereal disease rates trending down, nutrition markers trending up, vaccination rosters posted by district, clinic hours printed on broadsheets. A chaplain on the same team asked if anyone needed blankets. No one wrote speeches. They wrote schedules. The revelation every skeptic expects to fail is discipline. Shut the so-called safety valve, and troops will break the rules, right? That is where American command proved its spine. SCAP orders were not suggestion. They were marching instructions, backed by MPs who walked beats in alleys and bars, by commanders who hammered consequences, by chaplains who spoke to shame and pride in the same breath. The payoff was order without cruelty. There were brawls and there were offenders, but the big picture held. The conqueror bound himself to a code even when convenience argued otherwise. That code did not weaken the mission. It defined it. A Japanese city official who had expected compromise watched brothels close and clinics open. "Your patience is a weapon," he told an American lieutenant through a translator, baffled and moved. It is a hard sentence for a career bureaucrat trained in hierarchy and obedience. He had seen uniforms used to take. He now saw uniforms used to give and to guard the giving. He saw MPs escorting women home at night and arresting men who thought the old rules still applied. He saw population surveys done with school teachers and ration cards issued with the calm of clerks who expect to be audited. That is not charity alone. That is statecraft you can measure. A corporal with the 1st Cavalry Division kept a pocket notebook of sights. He wrote about the smell of fish markets waking up before dawn, about kids chalking hopscotch on a street with bomb scars, about a woman who bowed too low until he waved it away and handed her a tin of powdered milk. He wrote one sentence that could sit over the whole occupation: "We are trying to be the country we say we are." He cleaned his M1 Garand more out of habit than fear and walked his beat under neon that buzzed like insects. He did not feel like a conqueror. He felt like a guardian posted to the border between past and future. The enemy's shock, by now, had a new shape. It was not the fear of a knock at midnight. It was the silence after a fair hearing. It was a grievance resolved by a clerk instead of an officer's whim. It was a city that found itself policed by laws that the police followed. The old empire had trafficked in force and ritual shame. The new order trafficked in patience and paper, with muscle behind both. In that contrast, people's imaginations turned. When power behaves, peace begins to feel possible. The docks fed clinics and kitchens. The clinics stabilized households. The households began to ask questions about rights. Women who had been told for generations to bow and obey walked to polling places with babies on their backs and inked their choices. Civil affairs officers, translators, and local activists drafted rules for elections, debated the fine print of town charters, and posted results where anyone could read them. America's logistics had moved food and medicine. Now those same habits, lists, schedules, audits moved ideas. The next shock would not be a hull sliding into water. It would be a sheet of paper sliding into a slot, backed by a simple promise. The law, not the sword, will have the last word. A woman in a blue coat stepped to the box, fingers ink-stained from the ballot she would not let go, and dropped it like a stone into history. It was April, the air cool and bright, and Tokyo streets still wore their war wounds, broken cornices, scorch marks, a quiet tremor in every crowd. She had been told for a lifetime to bow, not choose. She chose. An American lieutenant watched from the doorway with a translator and a clipboard, not as a lord, but as a referee, checking the registers, time-stamping the line, and smiling when mothers showed up with babies strapped to their backs. The idea that power could be measured this way, by paper and patience, felt like a trick at first, then like oxygen. Inside the ward office, a civil affairs team posted the rules in both languages. One man read them aloud, steady as a metronome. No intimidation, no ballot handling by parties, rails to guide the queue, counters chosen by lot, a public tally at day's end. People nodded because the rules were simple and fair and printed in plain letters. They read the schedule for the next set of town meetings as if the paper warmed their hands. A clerk watched a grandmother trace her name with a finger, smiled, and helped her sign for the first time. The small things added up. A pencil on a string, a sealed box, a posted count, a public correction when a number looked off. That is how a republic teaches itself to walk. The enemy's shock here was not terror. It was surprise that the conqueror deferred to a process. Men who once wore swords on their hips watched MPs enforce order without swagger and understood the future in a flash. The gun would not speak last. A city official who had planned for evasion instead found himself cooperating because cooperation worked better. He watched an American captain explain to a loud partisan that the rules protect the loser most of all, and the room went quiet, the first respectable silence of the new era. "If the rules are fair, you can wait your turn," the captain said, "and the country will still be yours tomorrow." That line was a bridge from fear to duty. A young activist named Shizu brought her friends to observe the count. She had practiced signatures and speeches in a mirror for weeks. She whispered, "I am going to stand in sun," a phrase she had written on a scrap of paper and folded in her sleeve. When the tally finished, she clapped just once, not to celebrate a side but to honor the act. A translator jotted down another sentence from a voter who bowed and said, "We did not vote to become American. We voted so we can choose to become ourselves." Honest words travel farther than marching songs. They explain why a military victory hardened into a civil peace. Here is the shock statistic hiding in plain sight. In a nation the world had feared for its swords, more than half of all eligible women stepped into the light and voted. Think about the logistics for a heartbeat. Registration lists restored from bomb-scorched offices, streets cleared and posted, police briefed to stand back unless called, ballot boxes built in carpentry shops that just a month before fixed doors and window frames, truckloads of paper delivered by men who once wore helmets over the ocean and now wore caps on city streets. The same discipline that fed clinics and shut vice districts ran straight through the heart of this day. America's values did not sit on a shelf. They moved on schedules and checklists, a living machine of freedom. In the Daiichi building, where General MacArthur kept headquarters, a staffer penciled a note for a report. Turnout beyond expectations, few disturbances, or women confident. That clipped style fit the moment. No speeches, no parades, just work, forms, and results. The staff knew what they had done was rare in history. They also knew that you do not boast about a harvest, while the stalks are still standing. You keep cutting straight, row after row, until the field is clear and the barn is full. The rustle of paper, behind the rustle were ships and planes, factories and maps. A country that made the miracle look ordinary. We built ballots because we could build everything else. The next surprise lands from the sky, the machines that not only ruled air over Tokyo, but also changed what air power meant. Range, escort, the long arm that reached across an ocean and then guarded the peace it made. We are going to open a hangar door and show you what an industrial democracy does when it decides the sky itself should be safe. A pilot ran his hand along the leading edge of a P-51D Mustang and felt the cold bite through his glove, a smooth wing married to a Merlin heart that drank the sky like it was easy. He checked the drop tanks, checked the 50 seconds, checked the trim tabs a crew chief had adjusted to a whisper. The Mustang sat long and lethal on the tarmac, the sunlight crawling across its canopy like a promise. With those tanks, with that engine, the fighter could go all the way and back, not just to the shoreline but to the heart, riding shotgun on bombers whose bellies held the end of a war. This was the chapter where distance stopped being an enemy and became a route. The B-29 seconds lifted from runways carved into island coral, wheels thumping twice before the ocean fell away, and the horizon filled with aluminum. Inside the pressurized fuselage, men strapped in at stations that looked like a science fiction movie. Central fire control sites, radio racks, a tunnel running over the bomb bay to the tail. The engines beat a steady four-note rhythm that put fear to sleep. Crews learned to trust numbers' true airspeed, fuel burn, altitude instead of luck. A 20,000-pound payload changed what a map meant. When you can reach a factory across an ocean, build the runways that let you do it, and escort the formation home with fighters that used to be too short-legged for, and the job, you have turned imagination into strategy. An airman read a letter from home that simply said, "Be the sky they can't escape," and smiled at the phrase because it was both brutal and merciful. Brutal because it meant a net of metal over a nation that had chosen war. Merciful because domination by range and numbers ends a fight sooner. The Mustang's Packard-built Merlin was an English idea honed on American machines by American hands, a union that made a fuselage sing. Its 6 Brownings spat honest fire, the kind that saves crews. The B-29's Norden was not magic, but it was good enough when good enough multiplied by hundreds shows up every week. You cannot outbreed mathematics with courage alone. The enemy's shock came first as disbelief. Pilots scrambled and found escorts where none had lived before. Factory managers thought night and cloud would keep them safe, and learned that maps do not block radar and timing. Anti-air gunners watched formations that looked like entire weather systems. Every speck, a ship with a crew who had trained on checklists, until heartbeat and procedure moved together. An ace once said he could read an enemy's soul in a turn. Now, he read figures and saw the future instead. Time on target, escort overhead, fresh rotations, and a repair chain that did not blink. Here's your holy shit moment framed as a smell and a sound. A ground crewman stood by the refueling truck, while high-octane gas made the air sweet and sharp. He listened to the hydraulic whine as bomb bay doors cycled for inspection, to the click of panel screws, to the ratchet song of a torque wrench finding its last notch. He knew every noise in that bird. He knew where the skin oil from 1,000 hands had polished the aluminum along a maintenance path. He knew that his work sent strangers home alive. He wiped the fuel splatter from his sleeve and watched the squadron leader raise 2 fingers for engine start. That's logistics as a hymn. The human element never went away. A tail gunner named Willie traced the letters on a package from his sister before sliding it into a duffel. A navigator named Rosa leaned over a chart with a red pencil and drew a line so straight it looked printed. A crew chief named Meyer, who once fixed farm combines, told a pilot, "Bring her back, I've got your name on my wrenches." They weren't saints. They were Americans given good tools and a mission worth their sleep. The bridge to where we go next is simple arithmetic, loaded with ore. Air drove the enemy to the edge. Sea delivered the push. Ground and governance sealed the peace. Now we stack the production scoreboard with numbers that make you sit back. Trucks by the millions. Rifles by the millions. Radios, boots, field kitchens, bulldozers, rails, everything with a part number and a manual. We are about to count like a quartermaster and smile like a father at graduation. The diploma reads, Domination by Design. Midnight in Tokyo, neon buzzing. Rain turning the street into a mirror, and a military policeman stepped between a drunk GI and a terrified shopkeeper, with a voice that carried more law than volume. "Back to barracks," he said, one hand open, one hand ready. His partner took the shopkeeper's statement, wrote down names, and handed over a card that listed the station, hours, and complaint number. Nothing dramatic happened after that, which is the most dramatic thing in a city recovering from war. It was the difference between occupation and order. A conqueror who polices himself so civilians can sleep. The critics had predicted chaos when licensed brothels were closed, 1,000 temptations left loose, and young men far from home told to stand down. The critics were wrong, not because soldiers turned into angels, but because command turned values into rules and rules into routes. Checkpoints in the right places. Curfews with teeth, clubs inspected, permits posted, black markets raided, commanders reading daily incident logs like they were battle maps. A chaplain talked to a squad about liberty and responsibility the way a coach talks about ball security. If you fumble the story of who we are, the other team scores. The squad listened because they knew he was right and because peer pride is a strong wall. A private first class with the 11th Airborne wrote home, "They tell us the uniform makes us ambassadors, and it's corny until you see a kid's face when you hand his mother a can of milk." That sentence travelled farther than he did. A sergeant in the 1st Cavalry kept a diary line that could have been a mission statement. "We enforce so we can rebuild." Those small words made big choices. It is easier to swagger than to stand a post in the rain and tell a buddy to leave a bar. It is harder to be decent on schedule. The MPs picked the hard road and walked it. The enemy's shock here was inward. It was not a fear of whips and boots. It was the realization that the cops wore restraint like armor. A city used to edicts learned to read notices with dates and signatures and appeals. Women who had been told to expect the worst from soldiers learned that complaint numbers could make problems move. That slow, grinding respect did not look like fireworks, but it lit the future. If you want to see how power wins without firing, watch a citizen leave a station with a stamped form and a lifted chin. Here's a moment from an alley that explains the whole thing. Two young men, uniforms rumpled from long duty, hear a shout and find three teenagers trying to pull a sack from a woman's shoulder. No heroics. One MP blocks the path, the other steps behind, calm as a chess move. "Not tonight," he says. They walk the kids to a jeep, write the report, and take the woman home. She tries to bow too low. They wave it off, then remind her to keep the police number by the door. The scene is small. The message is huge. We came to end a kind of violence, and we will not let its shadow linger. The thread from this chapter to the next is iron and ink. Iron is the discipline that lets a country order itself. Ink is what turns that discipline into a constitution, laws and rights printed where everyone can see them. When women vote, when a shopkeeper calls a number, when a mother walks home without checking every shadow twice, you have conquered in the only way that sticks, by giving power the habit of obeying its own limits. Now we will pivot to the scoreboard that made this possible in the first place. The numbers will make you whistle. The scale will make you shake your head. The pride will feel clean. A quartermaster unrolled a canvas chart that looked like a myth. Trucks by the millions, rifles by the millions, planes by the hundreds of thousands, ships by the thousands, radios like rain. A pencil traced the line where industry took the field. The United States did not just tip the balance, it moved the fulcrum. The phrase, "arsenal of democracy," was not a speechwriter's ornament. It was a warehouse you could walk, a smell of grease and crate wood, a clatter of forklifts, a bell at noon, a foreman counting off numbers that buried dictators under tonnage. When the count ended, America had supplied the lion's share of Allied equipment and still had enough left to feed the peace. Think small to feel big. A Jeep, call it a Willys MB, was a steel handshake. Low, square, stubborn, born to climb gullies and carry hope. America built them like a habit, more than 500,000 strong, until the sight of that flat hood felt like daylight after a tunnel. Trucks, 2 million plus, a river of rubber and gears that kept armies from starving at the line. Rifles, the M1 Garand, semi-automatic. 8 rounds on a clip you could slap home with a smile because you knew what it meant. Firepower in the hands of a citizen army. Radios made orders faster than fear. Kitchens boiled coffee where enemies expected hunger. Bulldozers moved, earth like it owed a debt. A factory manager told a visitor, "We are not making things, we are making time." His line produced artillery shells at a cadence that matched trains to the hour. Women in coveralls inspected fuses under lamps that made their eyes ache, then joked over lunch about how the boys at the front owed them pie. Immigrants who had learned English on the shop floor read safety sheets like catechisms and then went home to teach their kids words like freedom and overtime with the same reverence. The story of production is not only steel. It is the braiding of faith and schedule, of grit and grace. That is how you build a nation that can hold the load of a world. The enemy's shock, again, was arithmetic. Strategists in Berlin and Tokyo knew their own output curves by heart and drew the American line next to them. It shot up like a rocket and refused to arc. Even when Allied bombers took hits, replacement airframes, engines, and crews filled the gaps. Even when convoys suffered losses, shipyards erased them with launches. War colleges teach about mass and maneuver, but they do not always teach about mercy. The mercy that comes from ending a war early because you can make the enemy's next move pointless. That is not softness. That is a harder edge than any sword. Here's your punch that feels like a parable. A plant that once stamped hubcaps spent a night shift forming wing ribs. At dawn, a piano tuner who took the job as a wartime calling checked the rivet line by ear, tap, 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 listening for a bad pitch that told him a void hid under the skin. He found 3 and chalked them with a neat X. The foreman nodded and changed the drill sequence for the day. Music saved a crew that never knew his name. That is America. Talent, wandering in from unexpected doors and finding its place at the exact moment the nation needs it. The bridge forward is simple and solemn. All this mass, the ships, the planes, the crates with stenciled numbers did not exist for their own glory. They existed to crush an evil that had industrialized cruelty, then to raise up a peace that could stand alone. We have shown you the ballots, the MPs, the clinics, the runways, the convoys, the foremen with stopwatches. Now we will put the evil under a light and record what it was with the same discipline we used to build. Evidence will pile up like crate stacks, and the room will grow quiet, because even victory must bow to truth. A clerk slid a stack of affidavits across a tribunal table, paper warm from hands, ink still smelling faintly of metal. Names, dates, villages, unit numbers, routes. The map on the wall bristled with pins that matched testimonies with places, like stitches holding a wound closed. Men in uniforms that once commanded fear now sat under rules that told them when to speak. The crimes were not rumors. They had coordinates, witnesses, logistics, and the particular stink of systems that try to launder guilt by paperwork. The room learned how a euphemism comfort could hide an engine of rape. An American chaplain who had carried a camera in Nanjing years before had written down what he saw and who he saw it happen to. Later, investigators in China cross-checked dozens of survivors' accounts, one by one, sometimes walking for hours to find the schoolteacher who remembered, or the neighbor who watched soldiers drag a daughter away, or the cave where a girl slept on boards after 5 or 6 clients a day. They noted replacement rates, station rosters, patrol schedules, medical logs, the entire bureaucracy of horror. Numbers telescoped to scale, hundreds of thousands enslaved across Asia, with Chinese victims making up an enormous share, not an anecdote. Facts took the stand by the thousands. They did not waver. The enemy's shock inside that courtroom was a different kind of defeat. Commanders who thought the burn pits had eaten the past learned that other people's memories do not burn. Villagers pointed to scars, to horse paths, to graves. Women used words that tasted like ash and did not look down. Translators paused and asked for water and went back to work. The judges asked their questions in the same dry voices they would use to weigh a contract, because law must refuse drama when truth is heavy enough. The world changed in that quiet. An American prosecutor held up a typed order and read it out in a clipped monotone. The order matched a survivor's timeline and a corporal's diary. It matched an officer's report on rations. It matched a train log. 1 document is a thread. 5 are a rope. 10 are a bridge you can walk truth across in front of people who prefer fog. In that bridge, the war's purpose clarified for anyone who needed it. We were not only fighting for land or flags, we were fighting to kill a machine that treated women like parts and the conquered like raw material. A witness said, "I was not a metaphor." And the courtroom air changed temperature. She meant that she did not stand for anyone else. She stood for herself, and a system had tried to erase her into a statistic. The judges nodded. The audience understood. Numbers matter, but numbers are the ladder. A person is the roof. America gave that person a platform and a microphone and put a soldier with a notebook next to her, not to speak for her but to record her as she spoke for herself. That is a victory measured in decibels instead of miles. This chapter closes with a bridge built of paper again. We proved what happened. We named it. We printed it. We filed it so the next liar would find a wall where he expected a door. The same nation that could build a Liberty ship in 4 days could also anchor a courtroom so deep the tide could not move it. Now we step to the final ledger, the payoff in results so stark they read like fiction. Licensed vice broken by policy, ballots cast by those who had bowed, an air fleet that rewrote distance, a sea train that outran wolves, and a democracy planted where a sword once stood. The only way left to finish is to stack the trophies and then refuse to gloat, because the best part of American power is what it leaves behind. A production boss once said, "We smothered the enemy in an avalanche of production." And somewhere in Japan, a mother opened a ration tin and decided her child's future could start today. That's how the math lands. Planes near 300,000. Ships in the thousands with a Liberty built in 4 days and change. Trucks and rifles and radios stacked like a chorus that never runs out of breath. Add in orders that banned licensed brothels, because values are not negotiable. Add in ballots that let women stand in sunshine after storms. Add in MPs who walked alleys so night could feel like night again, not like history repeating itself. The ledger reads impossible until you remember it is all true. We closed the state's vice hallways with a memo and guarded the closure with men who held themselves to the code they carried. We opened clinics with medicine we shipped at industrial speed, then watched disease curves bend and infants gain weight. We ran elections where people who had only known ritual and hierarchy learned the snap of a seal on a ballot box. We stood in the doorways and acted like referees instead of owners. We were not perfect. We made mistakes, punished offenders, corrected course. But the arc is clear to anyone who looks with an honest eye. The conqueror limited himself and, in that restraint, found the leverage to lift an enemy into an ally. The enemy's shock finished as a realization, not a panic. No other nation on earth could have done all this at once, not because others lacked brave soldiers, but because the United States had built a machine out of citizens, factories, farms, classrooms, pulpits, and laws that could switch from total war to total reconstruction, like a gearbox dropping into the next sweet spot. We did not occupy to own. We occupied to prove a point about freedom you can measure in food, votes, and streetlights that come on when you flip a switch. Some victories are parades. The best ones are schedules that keep. Here are the moments that make you sit down. A bomber every hour at peak when the line found its rhythm. A Liberty ship in 4 days, 15 hours, 29 minutes when welders treated time like an enemy to be beaten. A fighter that could ride with the big birds all the way to the heart and home again, because an English engine met American mass production and logistics shook hands with courage. A rifle in a citizen's hands that fired as fast as he could aim, because a republic equips its people like it trusts them. A clipboard at a polling place that fixed a name to a number, because power must count every voice to remain worth having. A survivor looked at a camera decades later and said, "I was not forgotten." And that sentence is the medal on the last page of the book. She meant the evidence, the records, the names in cold type that still warm the air when you read them. She meant the clinics and the ballots and the justice that did not come with a drum roll, but did come with a docket number. That is how a nation proves its strength without shouting. It leaves the world better sorted than it found it. It makes decency contagious. This is the final bridge and the final punch. We won the war with steel and fuel and nerve. We won the peace with paper and patience and the courage to restrain ourselves. We shut what should never have been open. We opened what should never again be shut. We fed a former enemy until allyship took root. Then we stepped back and watched a democracy run on its own feet. Power without purpose is tyranny, the narrator says as the screen fades. Power bound to principle is liberation. The odometer spins one last time. Planes, ships, ballots, clinics, and stops on a single word you can feel in your chest. America.